There is something quietly astonishing about the sea. It covers most of our planet, and for most of human history it seemed like the edge of everything, a boundary, a limit, a place where the known world simply stopped. And yet, again and again, people pushed past that boundary. They lashed together reeds and logs, they stretched animal skins over wooden frames, they learned to read winds and stars and currents, and they sailed out into the unknown. What they found on the other side changed everything. Naval history tends to get overshadowed by the drama of land battles, the cavalry charges, the sieges, the famous generals. But if you trace the deep currents of how the world actually took shape, you find the sea running through nearly all of it. The spices that drove Europeans to circumnavigate the globe, the slaves carried across the Atlantic in the holds of wooden ships, the grain that fed ancient Rome, the silver that bankrolled empires, almost all of it moved by water. Trade followed ships, empires followed trade, and the world we inherited followed from all of that. What is fascinating, and what we will explore across this journey, is how rarely the great turning points in naval history began with grand ambition. They usually began with practical problems. A fishing community needed to reach better waters. A merchant needed to carry more cargo with fewer sailors. A navy needed a ship that could survive a particular kind of storm or outrun a particular kind of enemy. Small, unglamorous problems. And the solutions to those problems, accumulated over centuries, slowly transformed the world, from the first reed boats on ancient rivers to the oared galleys of the Mediterranean, from the sail-driven warships that fought across oceanic distances to the iron-hulled steamers that made those distances almost irrelevant. Each transition reshaped not just warfare but commerce, migration, and the balance of power between civilizations. And then came the submarine, the aircraft carrier, the nuclear-powered vessel, technologies so different from anything that came before that they rewrote the rules of sea power entirely. Along the way, we will keep returning to a set of questions that naval history raises again and again. Why do some fleets rise to dominance while others fade? Is it technology or strategy or resources, or something harder to define? Some particular quality of seamanship or institutional daring? Why did Athens build triremes when Sparta did not? Why did China send enormous treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean, and then, within a generation, stop? Why did Britain rule the waves for a century and a half, and what happened when that era ended? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions worth sitting with, because they illuminate something important about how power actually works, about how technology shapes history in ways that nobody fully anticipates, and about the quiet persistence of human curiosity in the face of open water. So let yourself settle in. This is going to be a long and unhurried journey across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, across the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic and beyond. We will move slowly, and there is no need to remember every name or every date. The goal is simply to let these stories wash over you. And the best place to begin is at the very beginning, before empires, before navies, before written records. When human beings first looked out at the water and decided to cross it, nobody knows who the first sailor was. There was no moment of recorded discovery, no name attached to the first deliberate crossing of open water. What we have instead are fragments, stone tools found on islands that could only have been reached by sea, ancient middens of shellfish and fishbone along coastlines that are now submerged beneath higher ocean levels, and the quiet testimony of genetics, which tells us that human populations moved across water far earlier and far more widely than anyone once suspected. The earliest maritime activity was almost certainly not dramatic. It would have looked from the outside like very little at all. A person wading into shallow water on a floating log, a family dragging a bundle of reeds to the edge of a river and pushing off into the current. The sea, at first, would have been something you skirted along rather than crossed, a source of food, a border you followed, a surface you touched only at its edges. Coastal travel, hugging the shoreline, moving from bay to inlet to river mouth, was probably the first form of seafaring. You could see where you were going. You could wade ashore if things went wrong. The water was a road, but a road with visible edges. The technology of these earliest boats was simple almost beyond imagining. Rafts made from bound reeds or logs. Dugout canoes shaped by fire and stone tools from single tree trunks, heavy and low in the water, but surprisingly stable and seaworthy. In some parts of the world, people stretched animal skins over frameworks of bone or bent wood to make lightweight craft that could be carried overland between waterways. Each of these designs reflected the particular environment where it evolved, the materials available, the types of water to be navigated, the purposes the boat needed to serve. What pushed people beyond the shoreline, gradually and over long stretches of time, was a mixture of hunger and necessity, and probably something harder to name. Curiosity, or the pressure of competition, or simply the knowledge that somewhere out there was more. Fishing was almost certainly one of the great engines of early boat building. The fish closest to shore are also the easiest to catch, which means they tend to be the first to be depleted. Communities that depended on fish for protein had powerful incentives to go further out into deeper water, where larger and more abundant catches were possible. Better boats made better fishing possible. Better fishing supported larger and more stable communities. Larger communities could invest time and resources into building still better boats. The cycle, once started, had its own momentum. Migration added another layer of pressure. As human populations grew and coastlines became more crowded, there were always people looking for new territory, new resources, new places to settle. The sea, which looked like an obstacle, was in many cases actually a faster and easier path than fighting through dense forest or across mountain ranges. A coastline, if you had a boat, was a road, and islands, which seemed isolated and remote, were often surprisingly rich in resources precisely because they had never been heavily exploited. The evidence for early seafaring is scattered, but genuinely remarkable. In the Mediterranean, stone tools of a type associated with a particular early human culture have been found on the island of Crete, suggesting sea crossings that may be extraordinarily old, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, though this remains the subject of significant debate among archaeologists. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the picture becomes clearer and more astonishing. The ancestors of the Polynesian peoples achieved what may be the most extraordinary feat of prehistoric navigation in history, spreading across the largest ocean on Earth and settling islands separated by thousands of miles of open water. They did this without instruments, without maps, and without written records of their techniques. They did it with deep accumulated knowledge of stars and ocean swells, of cloud formations over islands invisible beyond the horizon, of the behavior of birds and fish and wind. Sometime around 4,000 years ago, the expansion of what archaeologists call the Lapita culture began moving east through the Pacific, reaching islands as remote and isolated as Easter Island and eventually Hawaii. In the Indian Ocean, there is evidence of maritime activity stretching back many thousands of years, connecting the coastlines of Arabia, the Indian subcontinent, and East Africa in networks of exchange that predate any recorded history. The monsoon winds, which blow reliably in one direction for half the year and then reverse, made the Indian Ocean almost uniquely suited to early long-distance sailing. You could ride the wind out and then wait for it to turn and carry you home. This predictability likely made the Indian Ocean one of the first arenas of genuinely oceanic seafaring, as opposed to the cautious coastal creeping that characterized earlier travel. The innovations that made all of this possible accumulated slowly, each one building on what came before. The paddle was the first great tool of water travel, simple, direct, exhausting over long distances but effective for short ones. The oar, longer, and rested against a pivot point, gave more leverage and allowed larger vessels to be propelled with somewhat less effort. But the truly transformative invention was the sail. Nobody knows exactly when or where the first sail was raised, but once the idea existed that the wind itself could be harnessed to drive a boat forward without any human effort beyond steering, the entire calculus of seafaring changed. Suddenly, distances that had required immense sustained labour became manageable. Larger loads could be carried with smaller crews. Voyages that had been exhausting ordeals became, on a good day, almost pleasant. Navigation developed alongside these physical technologies. The earliest navigators worked by reference to what they could see: coastlines, landmarks, the depth and colour of the water, the behaviour of birds. But open ocean sailing required something more abstract. Stars became compasses. The position of particular constellations at particular times of year could tell you roughly how far north or south you were. The rising and setting of celestial bodies gave reliable east-west orientation. Ocean swells, which travel in consistent patterns shaped by distant winds and the geometry of ocean basins, could be felt through the hull of a boat and used to maintain direction, even on cloudy nights when no stars were visible. These were not simple skills. They took years to learn and were likely passed from generation to generation with great care, forming bodies of specialized knowledge that gave coastal and island communities real and lasting advantages. What is perhaps most striking about all of this is the paradox that the sea represents in prehistoric life. It was simultaneously the most dangerous environment a person could enter, and one of the most productive. It offered food in extraordinary abundance: fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds. But it could also kill quickly and without warning. It connected distant communities, allowing the exchange of materials, ideas, and genes. But it also separated them, creating conditions of isolation that could accelerate the development of distinct cultures and technologies. The communities that mastered it gained enormous advantages: access to a wider range of resources, the ability to trade over distances that land-based neighbours could not match, the capacity to move people and goods faster and in greater quantities than any overland route could support. Over time, this mastery of the sea began to create something recognizable as distinct maritime cultures. Communities whose identity was shaped by their relationship with the water, their gods associated with the sea, their social structures reflecting the particular demands of life aboard boats and on exposed coastlines, their technologies and knowledge systems oriented toward the challenges of navigation and boat building. You can see traces of this process in the archaeology of ancient coastal sites around the world. Communities that ate differently, travelled differently, and organized themselves differently from their inland neighbours, communities whose horizons extended out over the water, rather than stopping at its edge. This is the real significance of the earliest seafaring, and it is easy to underestimate because none of it left dramatic records. There were no famous admirals, no named battles, no chronicles written down and preserved. But the human capacity for seafaring developed slowly and laboriously over thousands of years along countless coastlines was the foundation on which everything else we will discuss rests. Every great naval power in history inherited a tradition of boat building, of navigation, of the particular courage and adaptability that ocean travel demands. That tradition had its roots here, in the unrecorded centuries when the first unnamed sailors pushed their reed rafts and dug-out canoes a little further from shore than anyone had gone before, and discovered that the sea, for all its dangers, was something that could be navigated. And once that discovery was made, the world was never quite the same size again. By the time writing was invented, the sea was already a place of serious business. The slow, patient accumulation of seafaring knowledge that built up over thousands of years of prehistoric coastline hugging and open water crossing eventually found its expression in something qualitatively different: organized maritime civilizations, with fleets, trade routes, harbours, and the political structures to manage them. The Bronze Age, roughly spanning from about 3,500 to 1,200 years before the Common Era, was when the Mediterranean and the Eastern Seas became genuinely interconnected worlds, linked by ships and the ambitions of the people who sailed them. The Minoans of Crete are often where this story begins, and they deserve their place at the opening of any account of ancient naval power. Their island, long and mountainous, and set at the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, was almost perfectly positioned to become a maritime hub. Crete had good harbours and enough agricultural land to support a substantial population, but not so much that it could be entirely self-sufficient. The sea was not an obstacle for the Minoans, it was their economy. From roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era onward, Minoan traders and possibly Minoan ships were active across the Aegean, carrying pottery, olive oil, wine, and the beautiful decorated goods that Minoan craftspeople produced. In return, they drew in timber from the forests of mainland Greece and Anatolia, copper from Cyprus, tin from sources that were probably quite distant, and luxury materials that moved along chains of exchange stretching far beyond any single trader's direct reach. What the Minoans built was something that historians sometimes call a thalassocracy, a sea-based empire, though the word empire probably implies more centralized control than the evidence supports. Their power rested not on armies occupying foreign territories, but on control of the sea lanes themselves, on the ability to move goods and perhaps to deny that movement to others. Whether they maintained actual naval forces to enforce this control, or whether their dominance was primarily economic and cultural, is a question the archaeology has not fully resolved. Their palace at Knossos, with its famous frescoes of leaping figures and elaborate ceremonial scenes, gives us vivid glimpses of a sophisticated civilization, but relatively few clear images of warships. What it does give us is a sense of a people thoroughly at home with the sea, confident in it, economically dependent on it, culturally shaped by it in ways that set them apart from the landlocked civilizations of the ancient Near East. The Egyptians had their own complicated relationship with the sea. For most of their history, Egyptian culture looked inward and southward along the Nile, treating the Mediterranean to the north with a certain wariness. The Nile itself was a highway of a different kind, calm, predictable, flowing through the centre of the civilization rather than at its edges. Egyptian rivercraft were highly developed, and the Egyptians were perfectly capable builders of large wooden ships when they chose to be. Under certain pharaohs, they projected maritime power quite deliberately. There are records of Egyptian expeditions to a place called Punt, reached by sea down the Red Sea coast, and wall carvings at the Temple of Hatshepsut, showing the ships that made this voyage and the exotic goods, incense trees, gold, animals that they brought back. There are also Egyptian records of naval battles, most famously the engagements against the mysterious sea peoples in the later Bronze Age, which we will return to shortly. But perhaps no ancient civilization understood maritime power as instinctively and as thoroughly as the Phoenicians. Originating from a narrow strip of coast in what is now Lebanon and Syria, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other, the Phoenicians had almost no choice but to become sailors. Their timber, particularly the famous cedars of Lebanon, was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, desperately sought by Egypt and Mesopotamia alike, civilizations that had the agricultural wealth to buy wood, but not the forests to produce it. From this initial trade in timber, Phoenician merchants built networks that eventually extended across the entire Mediterranean and out through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic. Phoenician trading posts dotted the North African coast, the southern shores of Spain, the islands of Sardinia and Sicily. Carthage, which would one day become Rome's most dangerous rival, began as a Phoenician colony. What made all of this possible, in practical terms, was the galley. The oared ship was the dominant vessel of the enclosed Mediterranean world for thousands of years, and understanding why helps explain much of what follows in this history. The Mediterranean is a sea of relatively light and unpredictable winds, particularly in summer, when much ancient commerce and warfare took place. The winds that do blow tend to be local and variable, shifting direction as they interact with the irregular coastlines and mountain ranges that surround the sea. A sailing ship in these conditions is at the mercy of conditions that may simply fail to materialize. An oared ship, by contrast, goes where its crew drives it, regardless of the wind. In a world before compasses and precise navigation, when coastlines were followed and specific harbours had to be reached on specific days to meet trading partners or military objectives, the reliability of oared propulsion was enormously valuable. Speed in a naval battle was almost entirely generated by oars, the ability to accelerate, to manoeuvre, to strike and withdraw, and this made rowing crews central to any serious naval power. The early galleys of the Bronze Age were relatively simple. Long, narrow hulls with a single bank of oars and a small square sail for use when winds were favourable. They were shallow enough to be beached rather than moored, which meant they did not require expensive harbour infrastructure and could be hauled ashore overnight to prevent the hull from waterlogging. This simplicity made them flexible. A trading galley and a raiding galley were not dramatically different objects. The difference lay mostly in the intentions of the crew. The trade networks of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean were remarkably sophisticated, and modern archaeology has been gradually revealing just how extensive they were. Copper came primarily from Cyprus, whose very name is derived from the Latin word for the metal, tin, which combined with copper to make bronze, travelled from sources in Afghanistan, Central Asia, or possibly Britain along chains of exchange that passed through many hands before reaching Mediterranean smiths. Timber for shipbuilding moved from the wooded mountains of Anatolia and Lebanon to the treeless plains of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Grain moved in the other direction. Luxury goods, fine pottery, glass, ivory, gold, linen, purple dye, extracted painstakingly from sea snails by Phoenician workers, circulated among the elites of a dozen different cultures, carrying prestige and political meaning along with their material value. A Bronze Age king who could offer another king a gift of fine Aegean pottery and Canaanite wine was doing something recognizable to any student of diplomacy. And then, around 1200 years before the Common Era, much of this fell apart. The late Bronze Age collapse is one of history's great unsolved puzzles, a period in which palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean failed in rapid succession. Cities were abandoned or burned, trade networks dissolved, and populations declined sharply or disappeared from the archaeological record altogether. The Egyptian records speak of the Sea Peoples, mysterious confederations of raiders who struck by sea at the coasts of Egypt, Cyprus and the Levant, and these invasions were clearly part of the picture. Egyptian naval forces under Ramesses III fought what may be the earliest recorded naval battle in detail. A desperate engagement at the mouth of the Nile in which the Egyptians, according to their own account, trapped the Sea People's fleet against the shore and used archers on land to shower the enemy ships with arrows. But the Sea Peoples were probably as much symptom as cause. The interconnected nature of Bronze Age trade, its great strength, was also its great vulnerability. When one node in the network failed, the effects rippled outward. Tin from distant sources stopped arriving. Bronze could no longer be made. Weapons and tools became scarce. Political systems that depended on controlling the flow of luxury goods lost their credibility. The palace administrators, the scribes, the specialist craftspeople, all of the complex infrastructure of late Bronze Age civilization required constant flows of imported materials to sustain themselves, and when those flows were disrupted, the whole structure proved surprisingly fragile. It is a pattern that will repeat itself across naval history with striking regularity. Maritime power creates wealth and complexity and connection, and those very qualities create dependencies. The Bronze Age empires of the sea were the first to demonstrate both the extraordinary potential of organized maritime commerce and the unexpected fragility that comes with it. They built a connected world. They also discovered, painfully, that a connected world can fail in ways that a simpler one cannot. Out of their collapse, something new would eventually emerge, and the Greeks who came after would take the lessons of the sea in directions that the Minoans and Phoenicians could scarcely have imagined. The Greeks who emerged from the wreckage of the Bronze Age were, for several centuries, not particularly impressive sailors. The dark ages that followed the collapse left them fragmented, localized, and largely focused on the difficult work of rebuilding settled life. But the sea was always there, and the Aegean in particular, that island-scattered, wind-fickle body of water, has a way of pulling people back to it. By the archaic period, Greek city-states were establishing colonies around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and the familiar logic of maritime commerce was reasserting itself. And gradually, out of that renewed engagement with the sea, came something that would change the history of warfare, the trireme. The trireme was an engineering solution to a very specific problem. If an oared galley's military effectiveness came from its speed and its ability to manoeuvre, then the question facing naval architects was how to pack more rowing power into a hull without making that hull so large it became slow. The answer was to stack the rowers, rather than a single bank of oars along each side. The trireme arranged its crew in 3 overlapping banks, offset so that each oarsman could pull without colliding with the man above or below him. The geometry required was precise and somewhat counterintuitive, and scholars debated for a long time exactly how the arrangement worked. A remarkable experimental project in the 1980s actually built a reconstruction, named the Olympias, and demonstrated that the design was genuinely functional, capable of bursts of speed approaching 12 kilometers per hour, and agile enough to execute tight turns in open water. What this meant in practice was that a trireme could carry roughly 170 rowers in a hull, about 37 meters long and only 6 meters wide. It was, by any measure, a specialized and demanding machine. The rowers had to be trained, coordinated, and physically capable. The work of sustained rowing at battle pace was exhausting in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from a distance. And because the hull was built for speed rather than stability, triremes were low in the water, easily swamped by rough seas, and not designed for long ocean voyages. They were typically beached at night, which required friendly coastlines or secure harbours. They carried almost no provisions. Every aspect of their design reflected a single priority: winning a naval engagement by striking the enemy hard and fast. The weapon that made all of this worthwhile was the bronze ram mounted at the bow, at the waterline. The entire tactical logic of the trireme was built around that ram. An experienced crew, responding to a skilled helmsman, could drive their ship at an enemy vessel, strike it below the waterline, and withdraw before the opponent could respond, leaving the stricken ship flooding and out of action. Alternatively, a faster ship could sweep along an enemy side, shearing off the oars and leaving the crew helpless. These manoeuvres, the Deekplaus and the Periplus, required not just individual skill, but collective discipline of a very high order. The difference between a well-trained trireme crew and a mediocre one was not a small tactical advantage. It was the difference between an effective weapon and a floating catastrophe. This has a political dimension that the Athenians understood with unusual clarity. A trireme crew of 170 men was drawn overwhelmingly from the lower classes of the city, the Thetes, citizens who owned too little property to serve as the armoured infantry that dominated land warfare. When Athens committed to building a serious navy, it was simultaneously creating a military role for the men who had previously been at the margins of civic life. Rowers were not passive instruments, they were citizens doing a critical and dangerous job. And the logic of democratic Athens made it difficult to deny their political claims once their military contribution became undeniable. The growth of Athenian naval power and the deepening of Athenian democracy were not merely parallel developments. They were entangled, each feeding the other in ways that fundamentally shaped the character of the city. The strategic pivot towards sea power came in the years just before the Persian Wars, and the name most associated with it is Themistocles. When a rich vein of silver was discovered at Laurion in Attica, Themistocles persuaded the Athenians to spend the windfall not on distributions to citizens but on ships, 200 of them. It was an audacious bet on maritime power, at a moment when the Persian threat was becoming impossible to ignore, and it transformed Athens into the dominant naval force in the Greek world almost overnight. The moment that vindication arrived was the Battle of Salamis in 480 years before the Common Era, and it stands as one of the genuinely decisive engagements in Western history. The Persian king Xerxes had assembled an enormous invasion force. The numbers given by ancient sources are almost certainly exaggerated, but the scale was real enough to leave a powerful impression on Greek memory. His land forces had swept through northern Greece, and Athens itself had been evacuated and then burned. The situation for the Greek alliance was desperate. The Spartan preference was to retreat to the Peloponnese and defend behind a wall across the isthmus. The Mysticals argued for fighting at sea. What followed in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast was a masterclass in using geography to neutralize an opponent's numerical advantage. The Persians had more ships, significantly more, but in open water numbers and the ability to maneuver freely would favor them. In the confined space of the straits, where they could not deploy their full fleet simultaneously, their advantage was stripped away. The Greek triremes, particularly the Athenian crews who were more experienced and better drilled, were able to engage the crowded Persian formation in conditions that suited their style of fighting. Persian ships struggled to maneuver, collided with each other, and were struck repeatedly by rams they could not evade. Xerxes watched from a throne on the hillside above the straits as his fleet was destroyed, reportedly losing around 200 ships in a single day. The consequences reshaped the ancient world. Persia withdrew, and though the threat would linger for decades, Greece was not absorbed into the empire. Athens, whose ships had carried the decisive burden of the battle, emerged with a prestige and power that allowed it to construct something close to a maritime empire of its own, the Delian League, ostensibly an alliance of Greek states for mutual defence. In practice, a vehicle for Athenian dominance funded by tribute that paid for more ships, more walls, the Parthenon itself. Control of the sea had not merely saved Greece from Persia. It had determined which Greek city would define Greek civilization for the following century, and whose ideas about democracy, philosophy, and the relationship between citizens and the state would echo forward into the cultures that came after. The ram of a well-handled trireme turned out to be, among other things, a philosophical instrument, one of history's more improbable connections between brute force and the life of the mind. The Athenian model of sea power, the idea that a city could project force, wealth, and influence through mastery of the water, did not die with Athens. It migrated, transformed, and eventually confronted one of the most consequential rivalries the ancient world would produce. But before getting there, it is worth pausing on a fundamental irony. Rome, the civilization that would eventually come to call the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum our sea, began as something very close to a landlocked power. The Romans were farmers, soldiers, and administrators before they were sailors. The sea, to the early republic, was largely a logistical problem rather than a strategic environment. And then Carthage made it unavoidable. Carthage was everything Rome was not, maritimally speaking. Founded as a Phoenician colony on the North African coast near what is now Tunis, it had inherited the deep seafaring traditions of its parent culture, traditions stretching back through the trading networks of the Levant to some of the most experienced navigators the ancient Mediterranean had produced. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, Carthage commanded a commercial and naval empire that stretched across the western Mediterranean. Trading posts and colonies in Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, and along the North African coast. Its navy was professional, experienced, and built around generations of accumulated maritime knowledge. Its sailors knew the winds, the currents, the seasonal rhythms of the sea, in a way that the Romans simply did not. Rome's strength was almost the mirror image. Its legions were a finely developed instrument of land warfare, capable of sustained campaigns, tactical flexibility, and the kind of ruthless logistical professionalism that had subdued most of the Italian peninsula by the time Carthage became a serious concern. What Rome had that Carthage arguably lacked was an extraordinary capacity for organised violence on solid ground, and an institutional culture that combined ferocious discipline with a willingness to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting. The collision between these two powers, the First Punic War, beginning in 264 before the Common Era, was triggered by events in Sicily, and Sicily made a naval conflict more or less inevitable. The island was not purely a land theatre. Supply lines ran across water. Reinforcements came by sea. The city of Carthage itself could be reached by sea in ways that Rome could not easily threaten overland. To prosecute the war seriously, Rome needed ships. And the story of how it got them has a quality that almost seems too neat to be entirely true, though the essential outline is generally accepted. The Romans, according to tradition, captured a wrecked or stranded Carthaginian vessel and used it as a template, building their first significant war fleet in a matter of weeks, while simultaneously training their rowers on benches set up on dry land. The precise details have the flavour of legend, but the underlying reality is remarkable regardless. Rome built a fleet of roughly 100 warships as a crash program, crewed it with people who had never fought a naval battle, and took it to sea against one of the most experienced naval forces in the world. The outcome of that first direct encounter, the Battle of Mylae in 260 years before the Common Era, should perhaps have been a Carthaginian walkover. It was not. The reason it was not came down to what is probably the most creative piece of naval improvisation in the entire period, the corvus. The Romans, understanding that their crews could not match Carthaginian skill in open water manoeuvring, essentially refused to play that game. The corvus was a boarding bridge mounted on a rotating pole at the bow, a spiked device that could be dropped onto an enemy deck, locking the two ships together and transforming a naval engagement into something that looked, from the Romans' point of view, much more familiar. Rather than a contest of seamanship and ram tactics, it became a land battle on water. The Roman legionaries who came across those boarding bridges were fighting on territory they understood, and the results at Mylae were startling. A Roman fleet on its first major outing defeated a Carthaginian force that had every reason to expect victory. The corvus is one of those innovations that reveals something interesting about how military technology actually works. It solved an immediate problem brilliantly, but it also had limits. The device was heavy, it made ships less stable in rough water, and several of Rome's worst losses during the First Punic War came not from Carthaginian rams, but from storms. The Mediterranean in winter, and in certain seasons around Sicily and the North African coast, can turn savage with very little warning. Roman fleets, partly because of the corvus and partly because of inexperience in reading sea conditions, were caught out repeatedly. The losses in some of these storms were staggering in 255 before the Common Era. Following an initially successful campaign in North Africa under the consul Regulus, a Roman fleet returning from the coast of Africa was caught in a storm near Sicily and lost somewhere between 200 and perhaps 360 ships, along with tens of thousands of men. These numbers may be somewhat inflated in the sources, but even a fraction of them represents a catastrophe that would have ended the war effort of almost any other ancient state. What Rome did instead was rebuild, and then rebuild again after the next disaster. The capacity to absorb these losses and continue was as much a weapon as the corvus had ever been, and it reflected something real about Roman institutional character, a kind of collective refusal to accept that a setback, even an enormous one, was a conclusion. The war lasted 23 years, and by its end Rome had developed something it had not possessed at the start: genuine maritime competence, not Carthaginian fluency perhaps, but working command of how to organize, sustain, and fight with a fleet in conditions that had once been entirely foreign. When Carthage eventually accepted peace terms in 241, before the Common Era, ceding Sicily and ultimately Sardinia and Corsica, the symbolic weight of the settlement ran deeper than territory. Command of the Western Mediterranean had shifted in a way that, despite the subsequent drama of Hannibal's land campaigns in the Second Punic War, would not ultimately be reversed. The longer meaning of Rome's naval development was not just strategic, but civilizational. A sea that had once been organized around Phoenician, Greek, and Carthaginian commercial networks gradually became a Roman lake, a highway for Roman grain, Roman troops, Roman law, and Roman culture. The Mediterranean, renamed in Roman imagination as their own sea, became the connective tissue of an empire that would define European history for centuries. That transformation had been possible because Rome, a city of soldiers and farmers, had looked at the sea as a problem to be solved rather than a barrier to be respected, and had solved it with the blunt, patient, enormously costly determination that it brought to most things. The lesson was less about seamanship than about will, and about what happens when an organized society decides that the sea too belongs to whoever is willing to pay the price for it. When the western half of the Roman Empire fragmented across the 5th century, the sea did not stop mattering. If anything, for the civilization that survived in the east, the sea became more essential than ever. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman state centered on Constantinople, is sometimes treated as a footnote to classical antiquity, a long twilight rather than a story in its own right. But in maritime terms, Byzantium was one of the most strategically sophisticated naval powers the medieval world produced, and it lasted for nearly 1,000 years, partly because its rulers understood something that seems obvious only in retrospect. The city they were defending was unreachable by land in any practical sense, so long as they controlled the water around it. Constantinople sits at the junction of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, at the narrowing where Europe and Asia nearly touch. The geography almost speaks for itself. Whoever held the city held the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between the grain-producing steppe hinterlands and the trading networks of the Aegean. Its landward walls were among the most formidable fortifications in the ancient or medieval world. The Theodosian walls, massive and layered, resisted direct assault for centuries. But it was the sea walls and the naval capacity behind them that completed the picture. An attacker who could not come from the water was an attacker fighting with one hand. The Byzantine navy existed in a very real sense to make Constantinople geometrically impregnable. Central to that naval capability was one of the most celebrated and mysterious technologies in all of military history, Greek fire. The name is a later Western coinage, but it captures something of the terror the substance inspired was an incendiary compound deployed by the Byzantine navy, most dramatically from siphon-mounted projectors mounted in the bows of their warships. It burned on water. It could not easily be extinguished. When Arab fleets attempted to take Constantinople by sea in the 7th and 8th centuries, Greek fire was among the tools that stopped them. The sight of flames erupting across the water, resistant to the standard attempts at suppression, apparently had a psychological effect beyond the material damage it caused. Contemporary accounts describe Arab sailors leaping into the sea to escape fire that followed them across the surface. What exactly Greek fire was remains genuinely uncertain. The Byzantines guarded its composition as a state secret, and that secrecy was so effective that the precise recipe has never been recovered. Modern scholars have proposed various combinations: naphtha, quicklime, pine resins, sulphur, and the debate continues. Some reconstructions suggest it may have been a petroleum-based mixture similar to napalm in its basic behaviour. Others emphasize the role of quicklime, which reacts violently with water, as a possible explanation for how it could ignite on contact with the sea. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and that uncertainty is itself a kind of tribute to the success of Byzantine secrecy. What we can say is that it worked, that it was deployed repeatedly in defensive naval engagements over several centuries, and that its existence gave the Byzantine fleet a qualitative edge that extended beyond any single battle. While Byzantium managed the southern and eastern Mediterranean with its combination of geography, fortification, and chemical ingenuity, a very different kind of maritime culture was taking shape in the cold waters of the north. The Vikings, emerging from Scandinavia in the late 8th century, brought with them a shipbuilding tradition that represented one of the genuine leaps in naval technology of the entire medieval period. The longship was not simply a fast vessel, it was a philosophical statement about how to use the sea, shallow in draught, flexible in its construction, symmetrical at bow and stern, so it could be rowed in either direction without turning. It was designed to go where other ships could not. It crossed open ocean. It threaded up rivers that coastal traders would never have considered navigating. It could be beached on a shore, raided quickly, and relaunched before any organised defence arrived. This combination of reach and speed defined the Viking approach to maritime warfare and expansion in a way that had no real equivalent in the classical tradition. The Mediterranean galley, for all its tactical sophistication, was fundamentally a vessel of known coastlines and established ports. The longship was a tool of penetration into river systems, into estuaries, into the interior of continents. Viking raiders appeared on the Seine, on the Loire, on the Volga, on the Dnieper. They established trading settlements that became cities. They reached Constantinople by river and negotiated trade agreements with the Byzantines, whose navy would have been wholly unable to reach them in their northern waters. The relationship between those two worlds, the disciplined, fire-wielding maritime empire of the south, and the restless river-crossing seafarers of the north, is one of the more quietly remarkable connections of the medieval centuries. Meanwhile, the emergence of Islam in the 7th century brought another maritime dimension to the broader picture. Arab naval power developed rapidly after the initial conquests, drawing on the seafaring populations of the Levant and Egypt, and within decades of the Prophet's death, Arab fleets were operating across the eastern Mediterranean, challenging Byzantine dominance and reaching into the Western Sea. Sicily, Crete, and parts of the Iberian coast came under Islamic control at various points, and the Mediterranean became, for a period, a genuinely contested space rather than anyone's lake. At the same time, Arab and Persian traders were extending their reach across the Indian Ocean in ways that European maritime history often underemphasizes, building on monsoon season navigation techniques that had been developing for centuries, connecting East Africa, the Persian Gulf, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia in a trade network of extraordinary scope. What medieval maritime warfare had in common across all these theatres, Byzantine, Viking, Islamic, was a general shift away from the mass ram tactics of the classical galley tradition. The great fleet engagements of the Punic Wars, with hundreds of warships executing coordinated manoeuvres, gave way to something more fluid. Boarding actions, fire weapons, raiding mobility, the use of ships as platforms for projecting force onto coasts and into river systems, rather than primarily as weapons against other ships. The sea itself remained what it had always been, a space for commerce, for pilgrimage, for the movement of ideas and peoples alongside cargo. Christian pilgrims moved by sea toward Jerusalem. Merchants carried silk, spices and manuscripts between cultures that were nominally at war. Pirates operated in the gaps between jurisdictions, sometimes barely distinguishable from the merchants they preyed upon. The medieval sea was not tamed by any single power. It was shared, contested, and crisscrossed by an extraordinary variety of human purposes, and that complexity would only deepen as the known world expanded and the oceans beyond the Mediterranean began to pull at the ambitions of those with ships capable of reaching them. That mention of Arab traders crossing the Indian Ocean by monsoon is worth pausing on, because it points towards something that European-centered naval history has often struggled to fully absorb, while Byzantium and the Vikings were reshaping the medieval Mediterranean and its northern margins. Entirely different maritime civilizations were building systems of ocean commerce and naval power on a scale that would have astonished most European rulers of the same era. To understand the full picture of how the sea shaped human history, you have to turn east and south, to the waters of the Indian Ocean and the coasts of China, where the story is older, in many ways more sophisticated, and almost entirely its own. China's relationship with the sea developed gradually, rooted first in the country's vast river systems. Warfare on the Yangtze and the Yellow River produced generations of shipbuilders and sailors who understood hull design, current management, and the logistics of moving armies and supplies across water. This inland waterway tradition was not separate from coastal and oceanic development. It fed into it. Chinese shipwrights were, by the medieval period, producing vessels of remarkable sophistication. The junk, whose name in Western usage has almost a dismissive ring, was actually one of the most seaworthy designs in the pre-industrial world. It featured watertight internal compartments, a principle that European shipbuilders would not widely adopt for centuries, along with battened sails that could be adjusted with relatively small crews and hull forms that handled open ocean swells with practical efficiency. Two technologies developed in, or heavily refined by Chinese maritime culture, deserve particular attention. The sternpost rudder, allowing a ship to be steered with far greater precision and in far more difficult conditions than the steering oars and quarter rudders of older traditions, appears in Chinese usage significantly earlier than in Europe. And the magnetic compass, first noted in Chinese sources as a navigational tool around the 11th century, represents one of those rare technological moments that genuinely changed what was possible. Before the compass, ocean navigation depended on stars, landmarks, and the accumulated experience of pilots who had memorized particular routes. With it, a sailor could orient himself under overcast skies in fog, at times when the world offered no visible reference point. The implications for where ships could go and when they could sail were profound. The Song dynasty, which flourished from the 10th through the 13th centuries, was in many respects the high point of Chinese commercial maritime engagement. Song China was heavily reliant on seaborne trade, both because overland routes were periodically disrupted and because the dynasty's economic sophistication, it was among the most commercially developed societies on Earth at the time, generated genuine demand for maritime exchange. Song ports hosted foreign merchants from across the Indian Ocean world. Chinese ceramics and silk moved outward in vast quantities. The navy was taken seriously not merely as a coastal defence force, but as an instrument capable of projecting power and protecting commercial interests at sea. The Yuan dynasty, the Mongol state that replaced the Song, inherited this maritime capacity and deployed it in characteristically ambitious fashion. Kublai Khan's attempted invasions of Japan in 174 and 181 are famous largely for their failure. The storms that wrecked the invasion fleets became embedded in Japanese memory as divine winds, kamikaze, a term that would acquire very different associations in another era of conflict. Less remembered is that these expeditions required the assembly of invasion fleets, numbered in the hundreds or even thousands of vessels, a logistical feat of extraordinary complexity that illustrates just how developed Chinese naval organization had become by the 13th century. Then came the Ming dynasty, and with it a figure whose voyages represent something genuinely without parallel in the pre-modern maritime world. Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral from Yunnan province, commanded 7 expeditions between 1405 and 1433 that ranged across Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coast. The scale of these voyages is almost disorienting when you set it against what was happening in Europe at the same time. The largest ships in Zheng He's fleets, the so-called treasure ships, were by most estimates considerably larger than anything sailing European waters for another century. The fleets carried tens of thousands of men. They transported live animals, diplomats, trade goods, and the symbolic weight of the Ming Emperor's authority across half the known world. What exactly Zheng He's voyages were meant to achieve is a question historians continue to debate with genuine interest. They were not straightforwardly commercial expeditions, though trade happened. They seem primarily to have been exercises in tributary diplomacy, demonstrating the reach and magnificence of the Ming court, collecting exotic gifts and foreign acknowledgements of Chinese preeminence, bringing back animals like giraffes that became symbols of imperial virtue in the Chinese cosmological tradition. They were statements of power expressed in the language of spectacle and prestige, rather than conquest and extraction. And then, after the seventh voyage, they stopped. The Ming court turned inward, the great ships were not maintained, and the Oceanic expeditions became a memory rather than a foundation for empire. Why that happened is one of those questions that invite speculation without fully yielding to it. Factionalism at court, the cost of the expeditions, a shift in priorities toward the northern frontier and its Mongol pressures, a Confucian suspicion of the merchant values that overseas trade embodied, all of these have been offered as explanations, and most historians find some truth in several of them simultaneously. What the end of Zheng He's voyages did not do was end Chinese maritime activity generally. Merchants from Fujian and Guangdong continued trading across Southeast Asia for centuries, building the diaspora communities that shaped the region's economic history in ways still visible today. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean itself operated as a maritime world of extraordinary complexity that owed very little to any single dominant power. Arab dhow traders working the monsoon cycles connected the Persian Gulf to the Swahili coast of East Africa and to the ports of western India. Indian merchants from Gujarat and the Malabar coast ran their own networks southward and eastward. Malay and Japanese sailors connected the spice islands of the Indonesian archipelago to the broader web of exchange. East African city-states like Kilwa and Mombasa were wealthy, cosmopolitan ports whose prosperity was entirely seaborne. The Indian Ocean was not an empty space awaiting European discovery. It was a functioning, highly integrated commercial system that had been operating for 1,000 years or more before any Portuguese ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope. What these different maritime systems shared was a fundamentally commercial orientation. Power in the Indian Ocean world was generally expressed through the control of ports, the management of trade routes, and the cultivation of relationships with merchants and rulers along the coast. Conquest of the sea itself, in the sense of establishing naval dominance over open water, was less the point than controlling the nodes through which valuable goods passed. This produced a different kind of maritime power than the Mediterranean tradition of galley fleets and decisive battle, more distributed, more dependent on trust and credit and seasonal timing, less dramatic in any single moment, but arguably more durable across centuries. When European ships eventually arrived with their cannons and their appetite for control, what they encountered was not an absence of maritime civilization, but a fully developed one, operating on principles that would prove surprisingly resistant to simple displacement. And it is precisely that moment of arrival, European ships appearing on waters already thick with commerce and memory, that marks one of the great pivot points in naval history. The Portuguese did not sail into emptiness when they rounded Africa. They sailed into a world, but the ships that carried them there were genuinely new in certain important respects, and the combination of technology, ambition, and ruthlessness they brought with them would ultimately reshape the balance of oceanic power in ways that neither side could have fully anticipated. The transformation in European seafaring that made those long oceanic passages possible had been accumulating slowly through the 14th and 15th centuries. Two vessel types sit at the heart of it. The caravel was the nimbler of the pair, a relatively small ship with a hull form that handled open ocean sailing well, and crucially carried a combination of lateen and square sails that gave it remarkable flexibility. It could sail closer to the wind than most contemporary European vessels, which mattered enormously when you were trying to navigate unfamiliar coasts and uncertain winds without the option of simply turning back. The carrack was larger and more capacious, built to carry the weight of cargo, crew, and provisions that genuinely long voyages demanded. Together, these designs gave European sailors something they had never quite had before: ships capable of sustained blue water sailing, away from coastal landmarks, for months at a stretch. Navigation improved in parallel. The magnetic compass, which had filtered westward from China through Arab intermediaries, was in wide European use by the 13th century. The astrolabe and later the quadrant gave sailors a means of estimating latitude by measuring the altitude of the sun or stars. Portolan charts, detailed coastal maps drawn from accumulated sailor experience rather than classical theory, gave navigators increasingly reliable pictures of coastlines and currents. None of these tools was perfect. Longitude remained an unsolved problem that would bedevil sailors for centuries yet. But taken together, they lowered the threshold of knowledge, and risk enough that captains became willing to commit to passages that earlier generations would have considered suicidal. Portugal moved first, and with a systematic ambition that distinguished its expansion from the tentative probing of earlier maritime cultures. Prince Henry, whom later tradition somewhat inflated into the image of a solitary genius called the navigator, was more accurately the organizer and patron of a sustained national project. Portuguese ships crept down the African coast across the 15th century, each expedition extending a little further than the last, mapping the coast, establishing contact with local peoples, and probing for routes toward the gold and spice trades whose wealth was already well understood. Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving the passage was possible. A decade later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey to India, arriving at Calicut in 1498, and returning with spices worth many times the cost of the voyage. What came next was not simply trade. The Portuguese recognized that the Indian Ocean's commercial system represented an extraordinary concentration of wealth, and they were not content to participate in it on equal terms. They brought with them cannon-armed warships of a kind that the Indian Ocean had not previously seen, not because the peoples of those waters lacked sophistication, but because naval warfare in that world had evolved along different lines, emphasizing boarding, raiding, and the control of choke points rather than the delivery of heavy ordnance at sea. The Portuguese exploited that asymmetry with systematic violence, seizing key ports, demanding tolls from merchant shipping, and constructing a network of fortified trading posts, Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, that allowed them to tax and control the flow of goods across thousands of miles of ocean. It was naval power deployed not primarily to discover, but to monopolize. Spain moved in a different direction. Columbus, sailing west under Spanish patronage in 1492, was looking for Asia and found instead two continents that no European cartography had accounted for. The implications took time to absorb. What gradually became clear was that Spain had stumbled into something potentially even more valuable than a spice route, a hemisphere of resources, including the silver of Peru and Mexico, that would fuel Spanish imperial ambitions for more than a century. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 attempted to divide the oceanic world between Portugal and Spain along a line of longitude, a breathtaking act of cartographic presumption that largely ignored the views of everyone else on Earth, including the peoples who actually lived in the territories being apportioned. Life aboard the ships that carried out this expansion was harsh in ways that are difficult to fully convey. A caravel on an extended Atlantic crossing might carry 30 or 40 men in a space roughly comparable to a modern bus. There was no proper shelter for most of the crew. Food was salt pork, hardtack biscuit, dried fish, and whatever the ship's stores could carry before spoiling, and spoilage was relentless. Fresh water went stale in barrels. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, killed sailors on long passages with a slow, demoralizing efficiency, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joints that ached unbearably, a creeping weakness that left men unable to work. A ship's crew on a long voyage might lose a third or more of its number before reaching port. Those who survived were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinarily tough. The human consequences of these voyages extended far beyond the sailors who endured them. The peoples of the Caribbean, Central and South America, and eventually Africa confronted maritime empire from the other end, as subjects of conquest, as sources of labour, as participants in exchanges so unequal they barely deserve the name. The population collapse among indigenous peoples of the Americas following European contact was catastrophic, driven by disease, violence, forced labour, and the systematic destruction of existing societies. The Atlantic slave trade, which Portuguese merchants began developing along the West African coast from the mid-15th century onward, would eventually move millions of people across the ocean against their will, a horror that was itself a maritime enterprise, dependent on ships, routes, and the organizational machinery of oceanic commerce turned to human trafficking. And through all of this violence and suffering and ambition, the world's economic center of gravity was shifting. The Mediterranean, which had been the core of Western commercial and maritime life since antiquity, was slowly being displaced by the Atlantic. The oceanic routes that Portugal and Spain had opened, soon to be contested by England, France, and the Netherlands, moved the most valuable trade flows westward and southward. Cities that had prospered on Mediterranean commerce began to feel the change in their revenues and their populations. New ports on Atlantic coasts grew wealthy. The geography of power was being redrawn not by any single battle or political decision, but by the accumulated effect of thousands of voyages, each one extending the reach of oceanic connection a little further than before. It was a process still very much in motion, and the contest for its fruits had barely begun. The contest for those fruits, as it turned out, would not be settled gently. What Spain and Portugal had begun in the 15th century was an opening move, and the rest of Europe had been watching with considerable interest and growing impatience. By the middle of the 16th century, a new kind of ship was beginning to emerge from European shipyards, one that would define the character of maritime warfare for the next 200 years. The galleon was not a sudden invention so much as a gradual refinement. It drew on the carrack's cargo capacity and the caravel's more purposeful hull form, lowering the towering fore and aft castles that had made earlier vessels top-heavy and difficult to handle in open ocean conditions. The result was a ship better suited to long oceanic passages, more stable, more manoeuvrable, and increasingly built around a feature that would change naval warfare fundamentally. Rows of heavy cannon mounted along the ship's sides, firing through gun ports cut into the hull. This broadside arrangement, which sounds simple enough in retrospect, required considerable engineering ingenuity. The guns were heavy, the recoil was violent, and placing them low in the hull meant the gun ports had to be sealed against the sea when the ship heeled in a breeze. But the reward was firepower that dwarfed anything a boarding action could achieve. A well-handled galleon could stand off at a distance and batter an enemy into submission without ever bringing the two crews into hand-to-hand contact. Sea battle was becoming, in important ways, a contest of gunnery and seamanship rather than of soldiers fighting on floating platforms. Spain put these ships to work in service of an imperial system unlike anything the Atlantic had previously seen. From the mines of Potosi in Peru and the silver deposits of Mexico, an almost incomprehensible volume of precious metal was extracted, refined, and loaded aboard ships for the journey to Seville. The Spanish organized this traffic into a formal convoy system, the floater, in which heavily armed galleons escorted merchant vessels across the Atlantic in coordinated fleets, typically twice a year, concentrating the treasure and the protection together. The logic was sound. Individual ships were vulnerable, a fleet with escorts was considerably less so. The wealth that arrived through this system financed Spanish armies in Europe, funded the imperial bureaucracy, and underwrote a political ambition that made Spain the dominant power on the continent for much of the 16th century. It also made the floater the most tempting target in the world. Every maritime nation in Europe that felt excluded from Spanish and Portuguese ocean monopolies, which the Treaty of Tordesillas had established, but which England, France, and the Netherlands had no intention of honouring, looked at those silver convoys with undisguised appetite. What followed was a long, complicated era in which the line between warfare, commerce, and outright robbery became extraordinarily difficult to locate. Privateering sat at the intersection of all three. A privateer operated under a letter of marque, a government commission that authorized him to attack the ships of enemy nations and keep a share of whatever he took. In theory, this distinguished him from a pirate, who operated without any legal sanction and could be hanged by any nation that caught him. In practice, the distinction often blurred to the point of meaninglessness. Francis Drake, to take the most famous English example, was a national hero in England and a corsair little better than a pirate in Spanish eyes, and the Spanish were not entirely wrong. His circumnavigation of the globe between 150–77 and 1580 was a remarkable feat of seamanship, but it was also a raiding expedition that plundered Spanish settlements along the Pacific coast of South America, waters where Spain had assumed it held unchallenged dominion. When Drake returned to Plymouth with a hold full of Spanish silver, Queen Elizabeth knighted him on his own deck. Diplomatic protests from Madrid were met with studied vagueness. This was state-sponsored robbery with a flag attached, and everyone knew it. The tensions this created, combined with deeper religious and political antagonisms, eventually produced one of the most debated episodes in naval history. Philip II of Spain assembled his armada in 1588, a fleet of roughly 130 ships, with the intention of covering a crossing by the Duke of Parma's army from the Spanish Netherlands to England. The plan was ambitious, logistically complicated, and dependent on a rendezvous in the English Channel that never successfully materialised. The English fleet, under Lord Howard of Effingham with Drake as his vice-admiral, harried the armada up the Channel in a series of engagements that caused damage but did not destroy it. What ultimately shattered the Spanish fleet was the combination of fireships sent into the anchorage at Gravelines, the failure to achieve the critical junction with Parma's troops, and a savage storm that drove the surviving Spanish ships north around Scotland and Ireland, where many were wrecked on lee shores. English propaganda quickly cast the outcome as proof of divine favour and English naval superiority. The reality invites more careful treatment. The Armada was defeated as much by weather, logistics, and the inherent difficulty of its operational concept as by English gunnery, which was in truth less decisive than later accounts suggested. The episode remains a genuine puzzle about what sea power could and could not accomplish in this era. The Armada's failure did not end Spanish power, but it accelerated the confidence of rivals who had been probing the edges of Iberian maritime monopoly for decades. The Dutch Republic, fighting for its own independence from Spain simultaneously, proved to be a maritime power of extraordinary energy and organisational sophistication. Dutch merchant shipping came to dominate Atlantic and Asian trade routes through sheer volume, efficiency, and the financial innovations that allowed Dutch merchants to spread risk across large numbers of investors. The Dutch East and West India Companies were, in effect, states within states, armed trading enterprises that fought their own wars and administered their own territories. The French, meanwhile, developed their own Atlantic ambitions, planting colonies in North America and the Caribbean, contesting the sea lanes with growing naval resources. What emerged from this triangular rivalry between England, the Dutch and France was a new strategic grammar. Colonies existed to feed trade. Trade moved along sea lanes. Sea lanes had to be defended. Convoys protected merchant shipping, but required naval escorts. Naval strength required dockyards, timber, hemp, tar, and the industrial infrastructure to build and sustain fleets. Everything connected to everything else in a system where maritime commerce and military power were not merely related but essentially the same enterprise viewed from different angles. Control of a single choke point in the Atlantic, a Caribbean island, a good harbour on the American coast, could translate directly into commercial advantage worth more than a land army. The ships that contested all of this were extraordinary machines for their time, complex, expensive, and demanding of skilled hands to sail them. The men who served aboard them lived hard lives, poorly paid and often pressed into service against their will, driven by a system that needed their labour and rarely thought much about their welfare. They were, in a sense, the human cost written into the margin of the ledger, while the Atlantic's wealth accumulated for others. The contest they were caught up in was only growing larger. That contest, as it grew larger, also grew more orderly, not in the sense of becoming less violent, but in the sense of becoming more systematic. The chaotic scramble of privateers and trading companies and opportunistic raids gradually gave way to something that looked more like organised professional navies, and with those navies came an entirely new logic about how ships should fight, how fleets should be built, and what it actually meant to control the sea. The central development was something called the ship of the line. The name comes from the tactic that defined this era, the line of battle in which opposing fleets would arrange themselves into long parallel columns and pound each other broadside to broadside. To qualify for a place in that line, a warship had to carry enough guns to hold its position without being immediately overwhelmed, typically at least 50, and the most powerful examples carried 70, 80 or more, arrayed across 2 or 3 decks. These were not ships that could be improvised or adapted from merchant hulls. They had to be purpose-built to the task, and building them required enormous quantities of seasoned oak, miles of rigging, hundreds of gun carriages, and a workforce with highly specialised skills. The emergence of standardised rates, first rate, second rate, third rate, down through smaller vessels, reflected a serious administrative effort to match ships to tactical roles and to ensure that the components of a fleet were predictable, replaceable and capable of operating together. The line of battle itself deserves a moment's attention, because it shaped not just how navies fought, but how admirals thought. The logic was straightforward enough. A ship's firepower was concentrated in its broadside, so to bring the maximum number of guns to bear on an enemy, you arranged your ships in a line, each one firing across the interval, none masking another's fire. The problem was that this arrangement also chained commanders to a rigid geometry. Once 2 fleets were locked into parallel lines, there was very little room for individual initiative. A captain who broke from the line without orders exposed his ship, and potentially the whole formation to disaster. The result was a tactical culture that rewarded caution and conformity. And for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, fleet engagements ended inconclusively because neither side could find a way to deliver a truly decisive blow within the constraints of line-of-battle orthodoxy. It was a system that made it extremely difficult to lose catastrophically, and equally difficult to win completely. Behind every fleet sailing in those careful lines was an infrastructure whose scale and complexity rivaled anything on land. The great dockyards, Chatham, Portsmouth, Brest, Toulon, later Cadiz and Cartagena, were among the largest industrial establishments of their age. They employed thousands of craftsmen, shipwrights, caulkers, riggers, sailmakers, smiths, rope makers. They maintained dry docks that could take a first-rate ship of the line out of the water for repair, restoring the copper sheathing on the hull or replacing rotted timbers before the sea claimed what battle had not. Supplying these yards required organised networks reaching across continents, Baltic timber from the forests of Scandinavia and Poland, hemp from Russia, pitch and tar from American colonies, iron from Swedish mines. A nation that could keep those supply chains open in wartime possessed a strategic advantage that seamanship alone could not manufacture. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The most important battles of the age of sail were sometimes decided not in the open ocean, but in the counting houses and timber yards and parliamentary committees, where the money and materials were or were not secured. The men who crewed these ships lived within a world that was confining in almost every sense. A 74-gun ship of the line might carry 500 or 600 men in a hull not quite 200 feet long. The lower gun decks in particular were dark, damp, and perpetually smelling of bilge water, salt pork, and unwashed bodies. Sleep happened in hammocks, slung with 14 inches of space between each man. Food was monotonous, and often of poor quality. Weevils in the biscuit and rancid butter being more the rule than the exception on long voyages. Disease killed far more sailors in this era than enemy action. Scurvy, typhus, dysentery, and yellow fever between them could depopulate a fleet faster than any engagement. The gradual discovery that citrus juice could prevent scurvy was among the most consequential medical advances in naval history, though it took the British Navy a frustratingly long time to implement it universally. Discipline aboard these ships was severe and hierarchically absolute. Flogging was routine punishment for a wide range of offences. Mutiny was punishable by hanging, and the famous mutinies of the 1790s aboard British ships in the Nore and Spithead reveal something of how far conditions had to deteriorate before men risked their lives to protest them. And yet many sailors clearly developed genuine attachments to their ships and their shipmates, a community forged by shared hardship in an environment that demanded constant collective effort simply to keep the vessel alive. The sea itself was a more dangerous adversary than any enemy fleet, and the skills required to manage a square-rigged ship in a North Atlantic winter were formidable. The rivalry among European naval powers through the 17th and 18th centuries was relentless and expensive. England and the Dutch Republic fought 3 separate wars between 1652 and 1674, a sequence of conflicts driven almost entirely by commercial competition. Who would control the carrying trade, the North Sea fisheries, the routes to Asia and the Americas? These Anglo-Dutch wars were among the first in history fought primarily as naval contests of attrition, each side trying to wear down the other's merchant marine and battle fleet simultaneously. France, under Louis XIV, built its navy into a serious oceanic force, with terrifying speed during the 1660s and 1670s, guided by the administrative genius of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who understood that sea power was ultimately an economic and industrial problem as much as a military one. The wars of the late 17th and 18th centuries, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, each had a global maritime dimension that the land campaigns in Europe could not replicate. Decisions made in Caribbean anchorages and Indian Ocean harbours shaped the peace treaties signed in European capitals. What the era demonstrated repeatedly was that sustained naval power required not just brave officers and skilled sailors, but a financial system capable of funding years of expensive fleet operations, an industrial base capable of building and repairing complex warships at scale, and a government capable of holding all of it together under the enormous strain of prolonged maritime conflict. Britain, by the middle of the 18th century, had developed all 3 to a degree its rivals found increasingly difficult to match, not because British sailors were braver or British admirals more gifted, but because the British state had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to organise its resources around the sea in a way that compounded advantages over time. The stage was being set for something decisive. The stage was set, as it turned out, for the most consequential naval battle of the modern era, and for the man who would fight it in a way that nobody in the line of battle tradition had quite dared to try before. The French Revolutionary Wars, which began in 1792, and the Napoleonic Wars that followed them, represented something genuinely new in European conflict. Napoleon Bonaparte was, above all, a land general of extraordinary ability, and his campaigns across the continent remade the political map of Europe with a speed and completeness that stunned his contemporaries. But the wars he fought were not confined to European soil. They spanned the Caribbean, the coasts of Egypt and the Levant, the waters off India, and eventually touched the Americas. This global character was not incidental. Britain, unable to project decisive military force onto the European continent, without a reliable ally to bear the brunt of French armies, chose instead to fight where it had always been strongest, at sea. The strategy was to strangle French commerce, sever France's connections to its overseas territories, and deny Napoleon the resources that a global empire might have brought him. This meant blockades, long and grinding and inglorious, with British squadrons anchoring themselves off Brest and Toulon and Cadiz for months at a time, watching and waiting, keeping the French and Spanish fleets bottled inside their harbours. Blockade warfare was not glamorous. It demanded endurance more than heroism, ships rotting in Atlantic swells, crews wearing down under monotony, admirals managing the logistical nightmare of keeping a fleet at sea with adequate food, water and replacement supplies coming out from English ports. But strategically it was devastating. A fleet trapped in harbour could not escort convoys, could not threaten British coastal waters, could not strike at British trade. The slow suffocation of French maritime commerce was as important to Britain's ultimate survival as any fleet engagement, perhaps more so. Commerce warfare, the targeting of merchant shipping, also played its part on both sides, with French privateers hunting British merchantmen and British frigates, chasing down anything under a French or Allied flag. The economic damage was real and cumulative, wearing at the sinews of empires measured in trade. Into this world stepped Horatio Nelson, who was not what a successful senior naval officer was supposed to look like. He was small, physically slight, and by the time he reached his greatest fame he had lost the sight of one eye and the use of one arm in separate engagements. He was emotionally tempestuous, conducted a notorious and publicly scandalous love affair, and craved fame and recognition with an intensity that his contemporaries sometimes found exhausting. He was also, by nearly all accounts, a leader of unusual magnetic force. The officers who served under him described something close to personal devotion. He made a practice of explaining his intentions to his captains before battle, rather than issuing orders and expecting obedience, what he called a band of brothers, borrowing Shakespeare's phrase. The consequence was a cadre of subordinates who understood what he was trying to achieve and could act on their own initiative when the fog and noise of battle dissolved clear orders into uncertainty. In an era when naval tactics still carried the imprint of rigid line-of-battle caution, this was a meaningful difference. Nelson's tactical thinking had been sharpened by years of combat, and by a clear-eyed understanding of what the line of battle actually prevented. The old system's great failing was that it made annihilation nearly impossible, engagements ground to inconclusive exhaustion, and both sides withdrew to refit. Nelson wanted decision. He wanted not merely to defeat an enemy fleet, but to destroy it, to remove it from the strategic calculation entirely. And the plan he brought to Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805 was designed to produce exactly that result, at considerable risk to himself and his fleet. The combined French and Spanish fleet under Admiral Villeneuve was sailing northward off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast, attempting to reach Cadiz. Nelson had 33 ships. Villeneuve had 33 as well, and with the Allied advantage of numbers and position, the cautious option would have been to engage along conventional lines. Nelson instead divided his fleet into two columns and drove them perpendicularly into the enemy line, crashing through it at 2 points, and splitting Villeneuve's fleet into sections that could be overwhelmed in detail before they could support each other. The risk in this approach was severe, as Nelson's columns bore down on the combined fleet. They would present their vulnerable bows to full enemy broadsides for a long time, with virtually no ability to reply. The leading ships in each column absorbed extraordinary punishment before they could bring their own guns to bear. Nelson, aboard Victory at the head of one column, knew this perfectly well. He also calculated that French and Spanish gunnery had been degraded by the years of blockade, that his own crews were better trained and faster at their work, and that the chaos his attack would create would favour commanders whose subordinates could think independently. He was right on all counts, and wrong about his own survival. He was shot by a French marksman from the rigging of the Redoutable and died below decks as the battle resolved itself in the overwhelming British victory he had designed. 22 Franco-Spanish ships were captured or destroyed. The British lost none, though several were badly damaged. It was the decisive fleet engagement that the line-of-battle tradition had consistently failed to produce, delivered at last by a commander willing to accept catastrophic opening losses in exchange for the possibility of total destruction of the opposing force. What Trafalgar settled, and what it did not, is worth dwelling on. It settled, definitively, and for over a century, the question of naval supremacy in European and Atlantic waters. No serious rival would challenge British command of the sea again until the age of the Dreadnought. Napoleon, for his part, never seriously attempted another invasion of Britain and his continental system. The effort to exclude British trade from all European ports was a tacit acknowledgement that he could not beat Britain on the water and had to try to strangle it economically from the land instead. The strategic options available to him were measurably smaller after Trafalgar than before. But the battle did not end the Napoleonic Wars, which continued for another decade. It did not prevent Napoleon from dominating the European continent, from remaking its kingdoms, or from inflicting catastrophic defeats on the major European powers. It established that Britain could not be invaded, and that its trade could not easily be severed, but it could not by itself project British power ashore. Sea power and land power remained distinct instruments, each capable of defending its domain and struggling to impose its will in the others. Trafalgar was the last great fleet battle of the age of fighting sail, but the age itself was already nearing its end, carrying the seeds of a different kind of war within it, one that would smell of coal smoke rather than gunpowder, and announce itself with the sound of iron engines rather than canvas filling in the wind. That smell of coal smoke would arrive sooner than most admirals expected, and when it did, it confounded almost everything they thought they understood about how warships were supposed to work. The decades following Trafalgar were, in their own way, a period of strange quiet at sea, not because the world had become peaceful, but because British naval supremacy was so complete that no rival dared to seriously contest it. The Royal Navy enforced the blockade of Napoleon's Europe, hunted down slavers, projected power along the coasts of Asia and Africa, and carried the expanding machinery of British commerce to every corner of the globe. The wooden ship of the line, the great instrument of the age of sail, appeared to have proven itself so thoroughly that questioning its fundamental nature might have seemed almost impolite. And then engineers began doing what engineers always do, which is to look at an existing system and ask what would happen if you replaced its essential workings with something rather different. Steam power had been transforming industry ashore for decades, before anyone thought seriously about fitting an engine aboard a warship. The objection was not merely conservatism. Steam engines of the early 19th century were enormous, unreliable, and thirsty for coal in quantities that any ship would struggle to carry for extended voyages. The paddle wheel, the first means of translating steam power into movement on water, presented its own problems. The wheels sat vulnerable on the sides of the hull, exposed to enemy fire, and their presence made it difficult to mount the broadside guns that were the entire point of a warship. Early steam vessels were useful for tugs and ferries and shallow water operations, and the Navy found them handy enough for moving sailing ships in and out of harbour on windless days, but treating them as fighting ships in their own right seemed a stretch. What began to shift the calculation was screw propulsion, replacing the paddle wheel with a screw propeller mounted beneath the hull, and at the stern eliminated many of the tactical disadvantages in a single stroke. The screw was less vulnerable to gunfire, was more efficient at turning engine power into forward motion, and did not take up space along the sides where guns needed to go. Through the 1840s, experiments multiplied, and the famous trial of 1845, in which two British sloops, one paddle-driven, one screw-driven, were attached stern to stern and set against each other in a tug-of-war, made the case decisively and publicly. The screw-propelled ship won, dragging its opponent backward through the water. The Royal Navy ordered a first-rate ship of the line converted to screw propulsion almost immediately, and the construction of purpose-built screw warships followed. The sailing navy did not die overnight, but the trajectory was now unmistakable. The shell gun added urgency to a separate crisis. Explosive shells had existed for some time, but in the 1820s and 1830s, French artillery theorist Henri-Joseph Péchans worked out a design for naval guns capable of firing explosive shells in a flat trajectory, the kind of trajectory that would send those shells through the wooden sides of enemy ships. The implication was staggering. A wooden warship of the classic pattern, so formidably difficult to sink with solid shot, because the massive timbers of its hull could absorb tremendous punishment, became catastrophically vulnerable to shells that might ignite and blow apart once inside. Wooden walls that had stood for centuries were suddenly fragile. The Crimean War, which began in 1853 and brought Britain and France into conflict with Russia, offered a vivid demonstration. Russian shell-firing guns at the Battle of Sinope in 1853 destroyed an Ottoman fleet with an efficiency that wooden construction simply could not survive. The lesson was not lost. The answer to the shell gun was armour, and armour made of iron or steel plating, applied to hull surfaces, meant that the hull itself had better be iron or steel. Wood could not support the weight, and wood behind iron plating tended to splinter dangerously when struck. The shift from timber to metal construction was not simply a materials substitution. It rewrote the entire logic of naval architecture, the accumulated craft knowledge of centuries of shipbuilding, the industrial base required to produce warships, and the workforce needed to maintain them. Iron, and then steel ships required different yards, different skills, different suppliers. They required nations with heavy industry, with blast furnaces, with the capacity to roll steel plate and fabricate machinery at scale. Naval power was now inseparable from industrial power in a way that had never been quite so direct before. The American Civil War sharpened these lessons into something impossible to ignore. When the Confederacy raised and armoured the captured Union frigate Merrimac, rebuilding her as the ironclad Virginia, and sent her into Hampton Roads in March 1862, she sank 2 wooden Union warships and left a third aground, as if the age of sail had simply decided to surrender. The following day, the Union's own ironclad, Monitor, arrived to meet her. The engagement that followed between Virginia and Monitor was tactically inconclusive. Neither ship could seriously damage the other, but its strategic meaning was immediate and worldwide. Navies everywhere understood that wooden warships were now effectively obsolete. The question was not whether to build ironclads, but what an ironclad should look like. Monitor's design, with its low profile and rotating gun turret, suggested one possibility. Virginia's Casmac design suggested another. European powers experimented with both, and produced hybrid designs of considerable variety and uncertain effectiveness. The rotating turret was itself a revolution in the logic of naval armament. Broadside gunnery, which had organized warship design and naval tactics since the 16th century, required ships to maneuver into particular positions relative to an enemy to bring guns to bear. Turret-mounted guns that could be trained through wide arcs of fire changed that geometry profoundly. A ship no longer needed to be positioned broadside on to shoot effectively. The whole vocabulary of line-ahead tactics, the accumulated wisdom of how to handle a fleet to maximize broadside weight, became in some measure a historical curiosity rather than a living discipline. What all of this produced through the middle and later decades of the 19th century was something unusual and genuinely uncomfortable for naval planners. A period of deep uncertainty about what a warship should actually be. Displacement, armor thickness, gun caliber, engine power, ram capability, torpedo armament as that technology emerged. Each variable seemed to argue for different configurations, and no single design could optimize all of them at once. Naval architects produced ships that were fast but unarmored, heavily armored but slow, armed with enormous guns, but only a few of them, designed to ram but outranged by guns before they could close. Some ships that looked impressive on paper turned out to be dangerously unstable. The British turret ship captain capsized in a squall in 1870, taking over 500 men to the bottom and raising pointed questions about whether the engineers had gotten ahead of their own understanding. Naval power was now a contest in chemistry, metallurgy, industrial output, and coaling station geography as much as seamanship. Coal gave steam its meaning, but coal also imposed a tyranny of logistics. A steam fleet could not simply ride the trade winds around the globe as sailing ships had done. It needed to refuel, and that meant bases, supply contracts, colonial infrastructure, the whole apparatus of an industrial empire organized to keep engines running. A nation without the mines, the factories, and the global supply network to feed its warships was a nation whose naval ambitions would stall in harbour long before any enemy fired a shot. The age had ended one's certainty, and had not yet produced another to replace it. That replacement was coming, and it would arrive in the form of a ship so radical that it instantly made every other warship in the world seem worth reconsidering. That ship arrived in 1906, and her name was HMS Dreadnought. She was not the product of a single genius working in isolation, nor was she entirely without precedent in the thinking of naval designers who had spent years worrying about where battleship design was heading. But she was decisive in the way that very few technologies ever managed to be. Decisive not simply because she was better than what came before, but because she was so much better that she rendered the question of gradual improvement beside the point. Every armoured warship afloat on the day. Dreadnought was commissioned, became almost overnight a category of vessel now referred to as pre-dreadnought. That prefix tells the whole story. History had divided itself into before and after, and the before was already aging badly. What made her so transformative was a combination of ideas whose individual components had been circulating in naval engineering circles for some time, but which had never been assembled quite so boldly. Dreadnought was an all-big-gun battleship. She carried 10 12-inch guns arranged in turrets that could concentrate fire in ways previous mixed-armament ships could not match. She was powered by steam turbines rather than conventional reciprocating engines, which gave her a speed that earlier battleships could not approach. Her armour, her firepower, and her speed represented not an incremental improvement, but a fundamental reset of what a capital ship was supposed to accomplish. Navies that had spent decades and fortunes building mixed-armament battleships now found themselves in possession of ships that could not survive an encounter with Dreadnought long enough to be worth the engagement. For Britain, the immediate effect was paradoxical. The Royal Navy had triggered a technological revolution that temporarily erased its own quantitative advantage. Decades of accumulated battleship superiority counted for considerably less when the new standard of competition was something almost no one yet possessed. Other powers understood this very quickly. Germany understood it perhaps most keenly of all. The Anglo-German naval arms race that unfolded through the early years of the 20th century was, on the surface, a competition in shipbuilding statistics. How many dreadnoughts Britain was laying down compared to Germany? How many keels were being cut? How many ships might be ready by a given year? But beneath the numbers was something with far larger political dimensions. German Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz had conceived his naval expansion, not merely as a military program, but as a calculated diplomatic lever. His risk fleet theory held that Germany did not need to outbuild Britain. It only needed to build enough that a war between the two navies might so damage the Royal Navy that Britain would become vulnerable to third parties. A British government aware of this possibility might choose accommodation over confrontation. The fleet was an instrument of political pressure, as much as potential warfare. Britain did not respond with accommodation. It responded with the dreadnought race, accelerating construction, reorganizing the fleet, and consolidating ships from distant stations into a concentrated force in home waters capable of meeting the German high seas fleet. This redistribution was itself a signal, pulling warships from the Mediterranean, from distant imperial commitments, from the global patrol work that had defined British naval purpose for a century, and massing them in the North Sea. The implications for British imperial strategy were serious enough that they required formal agreements with France and Japan to cover the gaps. Threading through all of this was an intellectual framework that gave the competition its language. Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval historian and theorist, had published his landmark study of sea power in 1890, and the book had become something close to a sacred text for naval strategists in multiple countries. Mahan's argument, distilled roughly, was that history consistently rewarded nations that control the sea through concentrated battle fleets capable of defeating enemy fleets in decisive engagements, and that this control translated into commercial and therefore political dominance. Command of the sea was not a vague aspiration, it was a specific strategic objective achieved by specific means, and the nations that understood this would shape the world while those that did not would be shaped by it. Mahan was read in Germany, in Japan, in the United States, and at the highest levels of British naval planning. He had made naval competition feel theoretically coherent, almost inevitable. Technology was simultaneously advancing the practical means of exercising that command in ways that would have seemed like speculation a generation earlier. Wireless telegraphy was transforming fleet coordination. A commander could now communicate with ships over distances that previously required visual signals or physical messengers, which made the management of large dispersed forces genuinely possible for the first time. Advances in fire control and gunnery, driven by figures like Percy Scott in the Royal Navy, dramatically improved the accuracy of heavy guns at the long ranges that dreadnought engagements were now expected to require. The range at which fleets might meaningfully engage each other was stretching outward, which meant that the side that could hit accurately at greater distance held an enormous advantage. These were not abstract improvements. They shaped how planners thought about fleet concentration, about what size of force was necessary, about where ships needed to be and how quickly they needed to get there. The cumulative effect of all this, the arms race, the theorizing about sea power, the redistribution of fleets, the war planning, was to embed naval competition into the political atmosphere of Europe in ways that made the continent measurably more anxious and less flexible. The Anglo-German naval rivalry poisoned diplomatic relations between two countries that shared dynastic ties and significant trade interests. British efforts to negotiate limits on naval construction repeatedly foundered, because Germany understood the fleet as a political tool and was unwilling to surrender it for anything Britain was prepared to offer in return. Meanwhile, the elaborate planning documents that naval staffs produced, schedules for mobilization, blockade strategies, war scenarios, created institutional momentum toward particular kinds of conflict that was difficult for civilian governments to redirect once crises began to develop. Naval planning was not the cause of the First World War, and reducing 1914 to a shipbuilding competition would be far too simple. But the fleets that faced each other across the North Sea had been built through years of mutual suspicion and fear, and the strategic logic embedded in their construction had helped frame a world in which certain conflicts seemed almost structurally predetermined. The ships had become arguments, and the arguments had been running for a very long time before the shooting started. And then the shooting started. The naval war that actually unfolded in 1914 was not quite the one anyone had planned for. Mahan's vision of titanic fleet battles deciding the fate of oceans did not immediately materialize. Instead, the Royal Navy imposed a distant blockade, positioning its forces to cut Germany off from oceanic trade, without risking capital ships in the mine-strewn and submarine-patrolled waters of the southern North Sea. Germany, unable to break through this stranglehold by conventional means, turned to an older and more desperate instrument, the submarine. The U-boat campaign of the First World War was something genuinely new in warfare, and it made people deeply uncomfortable in ways that went beyond the purely practical. Submarines attacked without warning, sank civilian vessels, and operated outside the traditional codes that had governed naval warfare among European powers for centuries. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, with nearly 1,200 passengers lost, including a substantial number of Americans, crystallized just how radically the submarine had disrupted the moral calculus of war at sea. Germany periodically restrained its U-boat commanders in response to international pressure, then unleashed them again when the strategic calculus shifted, and when unrestricted submarine warfare resumed in full in early 1917, it very nearly achieved its objective. British shipping losses reached catastrophic levels, and serious discussions took place about how long the country could sustain the war at all. The solution, after considerable institutional resistance from naval commanders, who regarded it as defensive and therefore beneath them, was the convoy system, grouping merchant ships together under warship escort rather than letting them sail independently. The results were not immediate, but they were eventually decisive. Submarines that had been hunting with relative impunity in waters full of dispersed targets suddenly found those targets concentrated, protected, and far more dangerous to approach. Combined with improved anti-submarine technologies, the convoy system gradually turned the tide, though not before enormous losses on both sides. The great fleet engagement that Mahan's disciples had anticipated did come, once, at Jutland in the late spring of 1916. The Battle of Jutland was enormous, more than 250 ships, the largest clash of steel battleships in history, and its outcome was deeply ambiguous. Germany's high seas fleet inflicted heavier losses on the Royal Navy in terms of ships and men, and then escaped into the night with a tactical cleverness that British Fleet Commander Jellicoe, burdened by the weight of caution, failed to prevent. But the strategic situation afterward was essentially unchanged. The British blockade continued. Germany never again seriously challenged British command of the surface sea. The high seas fleet remained in harbour for the rest of the war, its crews eventually mutinying rather than sailing out on what they correctly perceived as a suicidal final sortie in 1918. Someone said at the time that Jellicoe was the only man who could have lost the war in an afternoon, which captured perfectly why he had fought so carefully and why Jutland produced a victor nobody could quite name. In the years between the wars, something quieter but equally significant was happening in the thinking of naval strategists and aviation enthusiasts. The airplane had appeared over water during the First World War in modest forms, and a handful of visionaries in Britain, the United States, and Japan began asking a genuinely radical question. What if the aircraft, rather than the gun, became the primary weapon of naval warfare? The aircraft carrier emerged from this period, not as a finished idea, but as an experiment shaped by treaty limitations that ironically encouraged innovation. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 placed caps on battleship tonnage but left carriers in a comparatively open space, and navies that might otherwise have built dreadnoughts began converting hulls and experimenting with doctrine instead. By the late 1930s, Japan, and the United States in particular, had developed carrier aviation to a level of sophistication that most traditional naval officers still privately doubted would ever matter. They found out how much it mattered on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor was many things: a tactical masterpiece, a strategic miscalculation, a moment that reshaped the 20th century. But from a purely naval perspective, it was the announcement that the age of the battleship as the supreme instrument of sea power was finished. 6 Japanese carriers launched their aircraft against the American Pacific Fleet's battleships moored in harbour, and in 2 hours demonstrated more clearly than any theoretical argument could have that air power projected from the sea had made the battleship's dominance obsolete. The battleships that survived Pearl Harbor would serve the rest of the war, often effectively, but they would serve in support of carriers rather than as the fleet's main striking force. 6 months later, the Battle of Midway confirmed what Pearl Harbor had suggested. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of the force that had struck Hawaii, were sunk within a single day by American carrier aircraft operating under conditions of partial intelligence advantage and extraordinary individual courage. Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it broke the momentum of Japanese naval expansion and demonstrated that carrier battles were decided by training, intelligence, coordination, and often by narrow margins of timing that felt almost like chance. The Pacific campaign that followed was a vast industrial and logistical contest unlike anything naval history had previously produced. Island hopping, amphibious assault, the projection of military force across thousands of miles of open ocean, sustained by convoy systems and fleet trains that kept ships at sea for months at a time. The Battle of the Atlantic ran simultaneously and in some ways was the more existential struggle. German U-boats, now operating in coordinated wolf packs and guided by signals intelligence that periodically gave them alarming advantages, came within measurable distance of severing the supply lines between North America and Britain. The counter-campaign involved cryptography, aircraft patrols, improved radar, hunter-killer groups, and again the convoy system, a grinding, invisible war fought in the cold and dark of the North Atlantic that rarely produced the dramatic images of carrier strikes and burning ships, but determined in a very practical sense whether the Allied coalition could function at all. What the two world wars had together accomplished was a fundamental reimagining of what navies existed to do. Command of the sea was no longer simply about defeating an enemy fleet in battle. It meant controlling the flow of supplies across entire oceans, projecting land power through amphibious operations onto defended shores, and sustaining industrial-scale logistics across distances that previous generations of naval planners would have considered impossible. The submarine and the aircraft carrier had shattered the conceptual framework that Mahan had built, replacing the decisive fleet engagement with something far more complex, far more dispersed, and far more demanding of coordination between sea, air, and land forces than anyone standing on Dreadnoughts' deck in 1906 could plausibly have foreseen. The oceans had become something genuinely different, and the powers that understood this first would shape what came next. What came next was unlike anything naval history had previously had to accommodate. The Cold War transformed the oceans into something that had no real historical precedent, a global arena of silent, continuous, and largely invisible competition between two superpowers who understood perfectly that a direct clash between them might end human civilization, and who therefore found ways to contest the seas without ever quite fighting a conventional naval battle. The fleets built during this period were enormous, technically sophisticated, and in some ways stranger than anything that had come before, because the logic driving their construction was not simply about winning battles. It was about preventing them. Nuclear weapons reached the sea in forms that genuinely changed the strategic calculus in ways that Mahan, Tirpitz, or even the architects of the carrier fleet would have struggled to recognize. The nuclear-powered submarine carrying ballistic missiles represented a kind of strategic instrument without precedent, a vessel capable of hiding in the depths of the ocean for months at a time, undetected, carrying enough firepower to destroy entire cities. The American Polaris program and its Soviet equivalents essentially placed a second nuclear strike capability beneath the surface of the world's oceans, one that could survive a first strike against land-based forces and still retaliate. This changed deterrence from a matter of missiles in silos to something far harder to locate, track, or destroy. The ocean's depth, its acoustic complexity, and its sheer vastness made the ballistic missile submarine perhaps the most survivable weapon system ever devised. For the first time in the long history of sea power, navies were not primarily being built to control trade routes or project force ashore. They were being built to ensure that no one would ever dare start the last war. The battleship, which had already been mortally wounded by the carrier and the aircraft, completed its quiet exit from relevance during these years. Missile technology had, by the 1950s and 1960s, advanced to a point where a warship could be struck at ranges far beyond anything that naval gunnery had ever achieved, and where the shells and guns that had defined surface combat for centuries were simply outpaced. The gun turrets came off. Missile launchers went on. The visual language of warships changed almost as dramatically as it had during the transition from sail to steam, and the strategic logic changed with it. A surface vessel in the Cold War era was either a platform for projecting air power, a hunter of submarines, or a missile-armed escort protecting something more valuable than itself: battleships. Those expressions of national prestige and concentrated firepower that had obsessed admiralties for half a century became museum pieces and eventually tourist attractions. What replaced the battleship as the organizing structure of naval power was the carrier strike group, a carrier at its center surrounded by cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels that together constituted a mobile airbase capable of operating anywhere in the world's oceans. American carrier groups in particular became instruments of crisis response in a way that no previous naval formation had been, because their combination of reach, flexibility, and striking power made them useful in situations that fell well below the threshold of declared war. A carrier group dispatched to a region in tension communicated resolve without necessarily committing to combat, and American presidents throughout the Cold War reached for carrier deployments as a kind of calibrated signal to adversaries, allies, and uncertain governments alike. The question reportedly asked in more than one crisis, "Where are the carriers?" captured something real about how these forces functioned in the political as well as the military imagination. Beneath the surface, a different and less visible contest was playing out continuously. Anti-submarine warfare became one of the defining technical and organizational challenges of the Cold War at sea, because the threat posed by Soviet submarines, whether missile-armed or torpedo-armed, required detection systems of extraordinary sophistication spread across entire ocean basins. The United States and its allies developed vast underwater surveillance networks. Patterns of acoustic monitoring cables laid across the seafloor, patrol aircraft equipped with increasingly sensitive detection equipment, and specialized hunter-killer submarines whose primary purpose was finding and being prepared to destroy Soviet ballistic missile submarines in the event of war. The Soviets built their own networks, developed quieter submarines, as American detection improved, forced American designers to develop still quieter and more capable boats in response, and drove a technological competition that consumed enormous resources on both sides throughout the entire Cold War period. Most of this was invisible to the public. Much of it remains only partially documented. But it shaped the oceans as thoroughly as any fleet battle ever had. The Cold War also expressed itself through proxy conflicts and crisis interventions that gave navies practical work short of superpower confrontation. The Korean War, the various crises in the Middle East, the Falklands conflict between Britain and Argentina in 1982, operations along the Vietnamese coast. These engagements tested Cold War naval doctrine against real conditions and produced hard lessons about what worked and what did not. The Falklands campaign in particular offered a sobering demonstration that modern anti-ship missiles in the hands of even a relatively modest opponent could sink advanced warships, and that the margin between a successful naval operation and a catastrophe was narrower than peacetime exercises tended to suggest. As the Cold War drew toward its close and eventually ended, the character of naval power shifted again in ways that are still being worked through. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed the peer competitor that had organized so much of Western naval thinking, and navies accustomed to preparing for massive fleet engagements in the North Atlantic found themselves more frequently engaged in humanitarian operations, coalition patrols, counter-piracy efforts, and the enforcement of international sanctions. Multinational maritime operations became more common, with navies that had once prepared primarily to fight each other now coordinating through frameworks like NATO and various regional arrangements to secure sea lanes that global trade depended upon absolutely. The container revolution had made oceanic commerce the circulatory system of the world economy, and protecting that system against piracy, against state and non-state disruption, against the simple chaos that follows from ungoverned spaces at sea, became as real a mission as deterring nuclear war, even if it produced far fewer dramatic images. Modern navies live inside a set of tensions that have no clean resolution. They are simultaneously symbols of national prestige, instruments of deterrence, tools of crisis management, and practical platforms for missions that range from disaster relief to counter-terrorism. The technologies driving naval development have accelerated to the point where drone vessels, hypersonic missiles, directed energy weapons, and autonomous underwater systems are already moving from speculation into early deployment. The logic of sea power continues to evolve in ways that would startle every admiral, from the Athenian Triremes at Salamis to the architects of the Dreadnought race, who contributed something to bringing it here. The oceans remain what they have always been, indifferent, vast, and absolutely central to how human civilization sustains itself. What changes is only who sails them, and why, and with what instruments of ambition and anxiety. There is something clarifying about stepping back from the accumulated detail of this long story and asking what it actually means. Not in any grand philosophical sense, but in the simpler sense of what patterns hold, what lessons recur, what remains true across the distance between a reed boat on the Nile and a nuclear submarine drifting silently through the deep Pacific. The most obvious pattern is also the most durable. From the earliest dugout canoes pushing tentatively into open water to the battle fleets that contested entire ocean basins, human beings have consistently reached for greater range, greater capacity, and greater capability at sea. Each generation of sailors inherited something from the one before and built upon it. Better materials, better navigation, better understanding of wind and current and hull design. The arc from those first fragile craft to the vessels that carry thousands of containers across open ocean, or that hide for months beneath the surface, is not a straight line. It bends and pauses and doubles back. But the direction over the very long run has been towards scale, complexity, and reach in ways that would have seemed incomprehensible to any earlier generation of seafarers. What that arc also reveals is how closely sea power has tracked with broader shifts in where wealth and organization concentrate. The societies that mastered the sea at any given moment were rarely simply the bravest or the most naturally gifted. They were usually the ones who had developed the economic base to sustain expensive fleets, the political structures to organize large numbers of people toward a common purpose, and the institutional memory to keep improving rather than simply maintaining what they had inherited. Athens needed the silver mines of Laurion. Rome needed the agricultural surplus of Italy and its allies. The Atlantic maritime empires needed the capital flowing through merchant networks that naval power then protected and expanded in turn. The relationship between sea power and wealth has always run in both directions simultaneously. Navies enabling trade funding navies, and understanding that loop explains a great deal about why certain powers rose and others declined across the centuries. Technology runs through this story as a constant engine of change, but it never quite did what its creators hoped in the most fundamental sense. Every new weapon, every new hull form, every new propulsion system shifted the balance of advantage, sometimes dramatically, only to generate responses that gradually restored some version of equilibrium. The trireme gave way to larger and heavier vessels when opponents learned to counter its tactics. The cannon-armed galleon changed the nature of naval combat, and then faced a world of opponents who also had cannon. The dreadnought made existing battleships obsolete, and then found itself made obsolete in turn by the aircraft carrier. The carrier altered the geometry of naval war, and then discovered that missiles and submarines introduced new vulnerabilities that no amount of air power could fully neutralize. Each technological revolution brought time and advantage, sometimes decisive advantage, but never permanence. The uncertainty that surrounded every naval engagement throughout this entire history, the fog of weather, mechanical failure, imperfect intelligence, and simple human error, never yielded entirely to any technological solution, however sophisticated. Which brings us quietly to the human element. Behind every development traced in this story there are people, individual people making choices under conditions of incomplete information and considerable stress. The Athenian rowers who made the trireme work were not abstractions. They were men sitting in cramped conditions, timing their strokes in the dark below the waterline, trusting the structure around them to hold. The admirals who planned the great engagements of the Age of Sail were men working with imperfect charts, unreliable signals, and fleets whose performance depended on thousands of individual acts of seamanship from officers and ordinary sailors whose names history did not always trouble to record. The engineers who designed the first iron warships were working at the edge of what anyone understood, making calculations whose safety margins were considerably thinner than the confidence with which they were presented. The submariners of both World Wars and the Cold War lived and worked in conditions that required a quality of concentrated trust in their vessel and their crewmates that most forms of military service never demanded quite so absolutely. Sea power at every level has been built, not just from iron and timber and gunpowder and nuclear reactors, but from the sustained effort and judgment and courage of ordinary human beings doing extraordinarily demanding work. And the sea itself has remained constant underneath all of it, enormous, indifferent, and ultimately ungovernable. Every civilization that has tried to master it has discovered the same thing. Control is always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on continued effort and vigilance and the willingness to adapt. The ocean does not remember who last sailed it confidently. It simply continues. That may be the quietest and most honest lesson this long history offers. Human ambition reaches outward across the water in pursuit of trade and conquest and discovery and survival, and the sea receives all of it with the same vast patience. The ships change, the purposes change, the scale changes almost beyond recognition, and still the water stretches out to the horizon, as it always has, waiting for whoever comes next.